A widowed father sinks into grief after losing his wife during the birth of their twins, unable to connect with the babies. When an unexpected caregiver arrives and wins over the little ones with pure empathy, the home begins to fill with life again. But a threat disguised as help tries to destroy this new beginning, until a revealed secret changes everything. Before we begin this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like on the video, which is very important to us, and tell us what city you're watching this story from. In the twilight of a London afternoon, the Kensington mansion seemed like an abandoned manor, even though its residents still inhabited every room. Edward Mitchell walked through the marble corridors like a ghost of his own life, his footsteps echoing emptily between the walls that had once vibrated with laughter and plans for the future. 3 months had passed since Caroline had departed, leaving behind 2 small beings who came into the world at the exact moment she said goodbye to it. The twins, Gabriel and Michael, were the perfect image of their mother. The same deep brown eyes, the same delicate line of the nose, the same way of furrowing their brows when something bothered them. But for Edward, looking at them was like plunging into a bottomless pit of guilt and longing. How could he love these little ones when every feature of their faces reminded him that Caroline was no longer there to see them grow? The baby's constant crying had become the soundtrack of that house. It wasn't the ordinary cry of newborns asking to be held or fed. It was something deeper, more desperate, as if they felt their mother's absence in a visceral and inexplicable way. Edward tried to get close, to hold them, to whisper words of comfort, but his arms seemed clumsy. His voice sounded distant even to himself. The boys would squirm, crying even louder, as if they could sense that this broken man couldn't offer what they needed. 7 professional nannies had already passed through that house. The first, Mrs. Martha, lasted 15 days before confessing to Edward that she had never seen such inconsolable babies. The second, an experienced nurse named Regina, promised that with patience and technique she would resolve the situation. She lasted 3 weeks before admitting defeat. The others followed in a frustrating dance of hopes raised and quickly dashed. All arrived confident, all left defeated by the mystery of that childhood suffering that no technical knowledge could decipher. It was on a rainy Thursday in September that she appeared. Edward was in his study, lost among company papers he could barely manage, when the housekeeper, Judith, knocked on the door with a different expression on her face. "Mr. Mitchell, there's a young woman here who wants to talk about the nanny position," Judith said, and something in her voice made Edward look up from his computer. "Judith, I haven't even posted a new ad yet." "How did she know?" "I don't know, sir. She just said she heard you needed help with the boys." Edward sighed, running his hands through his disheveled hair. Another candidate, another hope that would turn into disappointment. But there was something in Judith's expression that intrigued him. In her 50-odd years working for the family, she rarely showed genuine surprise. "All right, send her in." When the young woman entered the study, Edward felt a strange familiarity, as if he already knew her from somewhere he couldn't place in his memory. She must have been about 28, with light brown hair tied in an unpretentious bun, and green eyes that conveyed an unusual serenity. She didn't wear expensive clothes or elaborate makeup, but there was a natural elegance in her gestures, a presence that filled the room without arrogance. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mitchell. My name is Amelia Scott. I heard you're looking for someone to care for your sons." Her voice was soft but firm. Edward gestured for her to sit in the armchair in front of his desk. "Miss Scott, I must warn you that this is not a simple situation. We've had several professionals here, and none of them managed to—" Edward stopped mid-sentence, realizing how discouraging that sounded. "You were saying that none of them managed to calm the babies," Amelia completed with an understanding smile. "I imagine it must be very difficult for everyone. Babies feel so much more than we imagine. They pick up on the emotions around them, the sadness, the fear, the longing. Sometimes they need someone who understands that language." Edward was surprised by the naturalness with which she spoke about feelings. The other candidates had always focused on techniques, schedules, and scientific methods of childcare. "Do you have experience with difficult situations?" Amelia lowered her gaze for a moment, and Edward saw a shadow pass through her green eyes. "I have experience with abandonment, Mr. Mitchell." I know what it's like to grow up feeling that something essential is missing, and I believe that sometimes those who have lived with that lack can recognize the same lack. See in others. There was a raw honesty in those words that touched something dormant in Edward's chest. Before he could formulate a response, the twins' cries echoed down the hallway, that heart-wrenching sound that had become the worst part of his days. "They're crying," Amelia said, standing up instinctively. "They're always crying," Edward replied, with a bitterness that surprised him. "Judith must be trying to calm them, but may I see them?" The question was asked with such simplicity that Edward didn't know how to refuse. They walked together down the corridors to the nursery, where Judith was rocking Gabriel in her arms while Michael cried in his crib. The desperation in both boys' voices was heartbreaking. "Judith, may I take Gabriel?" Judith looked at Edward, who nodded. Carefully, she passed the crying baby into Amelia's arms. What happened next defied any logic Edward knew. Amelia held Gabriel with an impressive naturalness, as if she had done it 1,000 times. But it wasn't just that. She began to whisper words that Edward couldn't quite distinguish, soft words spoken very close to the baby's ear. Her hands moved in slow caresses on the child's back, and her breathing seemed to synchronize with his. "I know, my love," she murmured. "I know you're missing her. I know the world feels strange, different from how it should be. But you're not alone. You're not abandoned. There are people here who love you very much, even when it feels like the love is gone." Gabriel, who had been crying for 2 hours without stopping, began to calm down. First came ragged sobs, then a more peaceful breathing, until, to the astonishment of everyone present, he stopped crying completely. His little brown eyes fixed on Amelia's face with an attention Edward had never seen before. Michael, still in his crib, continued to cry, but his cry had lessened in intensity, as if he were paying attention to what was happening nearby. "Now it's your turn, my little one," Amelia said, walking to Michael's crib without letting go of Gabriel. Somehow she managed to pick up Michael as well, holding both babies nestled in her arms with an ease that seemed impossible. And then something magical happened. Michael also calmed down. He not only stopped crying, but he managed something Edward hadn't seen in months. A smile, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but unmistakably a smile. Edward felt his legs grow weak. Judith brought a hand to her chest, murmuring a quiet prayer. The 3 adults stood in absolute silence, as if any movement might break the spell of that moment. "How?" Edward began, but Amelia made a gentle gesture with her head, asking for silence. "They just needed to know that someone understood," she whispered. "Babies aren't complicated. They're pure. When they feel that someone truly sees them, that someone recognizes their pain, they surrender." Edward watched the surreal scene. Amelia remained there, gently rocking the 2 babies, whispering words of affection that seemed to have an almost supernatural power. Gabriel closed his little eyes and fell asleep. Michael soon followed. For the first time since they came into the world, the twins slept at the same time, in peace, without that expression of suffering that Edward had learned to fear. Amelia walked to the cribs and, with movements of extreme delicacy, settled each of the babies. They remained asleep, breathing quietly, with the serene expressions Edward had imagined they should have had since birth. "Miss Scott," Edward said, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. "When can you start?" "I can start. Now, if you'll let me." That night, for the first time in months, silence filled the Kensington mansion. But it wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence that Edward had grown to hate. It was a peaceful silence, a silence that promised possibilities. Edward stayed up late, not because of his son's crying, but because he couldn't stop thinking about the ease with which Amelia had achieved something no experienced professional had managed. There was something about her that went beyond techniques or knowledge, something that touched directly on what the babies needed: genuine understanding. When he finally fell asleep, Edward dreamed of Caroline for the first time without a nightmare. In the dream, she was smiling and whispering something he couldn't quite hear, but it sounded like, "She came, just as I promised she would." He woke up not understanding the dream, but feeling, for the first time since his wife's passing, that perhaps there was hope for his shattered family. Amelia Scott had brought something that none of them knew they were looking for. the possibility of healing wounds that had seemed impossible to mend. The first day of the new phase was just beginning, and Edward could hardly imagine how this mysterious woman would transform not only the lives of his sons, but his own understanding of love, loss, and new beginnings. The following weeks brought a transformation as gradual as it was profound to the Kensington mansion. Edward would wake up every day expecting to hear the desperate cries of the twins, but he was greeted by sounds he had forgotten existed, happy babbles, soft giggles, and, most impressively, the comfortable silence of contented babies. Amelia had settled into the guest room near the children's nursery, and her presence seemed to radiate a different energy throughout the house. She didn't just care for the babies, she understood them in a way that defied any logical explanation. When Gabriel woke in the middle of the night, she knew instinctively if he was hungry, sleepy, or just needed to be held. Michael, more sensitive and prone to tears, would calm down just at the sound of her voice, softly humming songs Edward had never heard before. "Where do those songs you sing to them come from?" Edward asked one morning, watching Amelia feed Michael while Gabriel played quietly in his crib. "They're songs I made up when I was little," she replied without looking up from the baby. "When I felt lost or scared, I would create melodies in my head. Music has always been my way of calming myself down." Edward noticed the shadow that crossed her face as she mentioned her childhood, but he didn't press. He had learned that Amelia carried her own scars and respected the mystery that surrounded her. What mattered was the daily miracle she performed with his sons. Judith, who had worked for the family for decades, confided in Edward that she had never seen anything like it. "Mr. Mitchell, it's as if she speaks the language of babies," the housekeeper would say, shaking her head in wonder. "And look how they've changed. Gabriel is already trying to sit up on his own, and Michael smiles at anyone who comes near. Before, they just cried." It was true. Gabriel had become a curious and active baby, always trying to reach for colorful objects that Amelia scattered around his crib. Michael, though still more reserved, had developed a luminous smile that could melt anyone's heart. But what was most impressive was how they reacted to their own father's presence. At first, Edward still kept a cautious distance. The fear of not being able to form the necessary bond paralyzed him, but Amelia, with her natural delicacy, began to gradually include him in the care routine. "Mr. Mitchell, Gabriel is trying to say something," she said one afternoon, holding the baby up to face his father. "I think he wants to tell his daddy something." Gabriel was indeed babbling disconnected sounds, but his little eyes were fixed on Edward with an intensity that moved him. For the first time, Edward reached out his arms without hesitation and took his son into his lap. "Hi, my little one," he whispered, feeling a tenderness that had seemed impossible for months. "What are you trying to tell me?" Gabriel smiled. A wide, genuine smile that made Edward feel as if his heart were being pieced back together bit by bit. Michael, not wanting to be left out, started to whimper in his crib, stretching his little arms towards his father. Edward, still holding Gabriel, looked at Amelia with an uncertain expression. "Can you hold both of them?" she asked, with an encouraging smile. "I don't know if—" "Of course you can. They're your sons. They know that, even when you forget." Carefully, Edward picked up Michael as well. Holding both his sons in his arms for the first time since they were born was an overwhelming experience. They snuggled against him naturally, as if they had always known this was their place in the world. "Caroline," Edward murmured, looking up at the ceiling as if he could see his wife. "Our sons are perfect." Amelia, watching the scene from a distance, felt tears well up in her eyes. There was something profoundly special about that moment, as if she were witnessing the rebirth of a family that had seemed lost forever. The days passed in a comforting routine. Edward began to participate more actively in the baby's care, coming home earlier from the office to help with bath time or to tell stories he made up on the spot. Amelia taught him little tricks, how to hold the babies to stop them from crying. What funny faces made Gabriel burst into laughter, how Michael liked to be sung to sleep. During these moments, Edward began to notice other details about Amelia, how her eyes lit up when she talked about the twins' small achievements, how she had infinite patience, even on the most difficult days. how she carried a deep sadness that she tried to hide behind genuine smiles. "Do you have family, Amelia?" he asked one evening, after the babies had fallen asleep, and they were having coffee in the kitchen. "I don't," she replied simply, stirring the sugar in her cup with slow movements. "I never have." "What do you mean?" "I was raised in shelters. My mother left me at a maternity hospital when I was just a few days old. I grew up knowing I wasn't wanted, that someone had chosen not to want me." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. The simplicity with which she spoke of abandonment contrasted with the pain he could see in her eyes. "That's why you understand so well what the boys were feeling," he said, finally understanding. "Abandonment leaves marks that you recognize in others," Amelia confirmed. "When I saw Gabriel and Michael crying like that, I knew exactly what was happening. They weren't crying from hunger or discomfort. They were crying because they felt that something fundamental was missing. The presence of their mother, the unconditional love that only a mother can give. But you managed to give that to them. Because I know what it's like to live without it, and I know how important it is for someone to show a child that they are loved, even when the world seems to have given up on them." That conversation marked a shift in their relationship. Edward began to see Amelia not just as an exceptional nanny, but as an extraordinary woman who had transformed her own pain into a tool for healing others. However, the happiness that was filling the house did not go unnoticed by less benevolent eyes. It was on a grey Tuesday in October that the first threat materialized. Edward was in his study when Judith knocked on the door with a worried expression. "Mr. Mitchell, there's a doctor here who says she needs to speak with you about the boys." Edward frowned. He hadn't scheduled any medical appointments for that day. "What kind of doctor?" "She said she's a psychologist, Dr. Renee Silverman. She's talking about child protection." A chill ran down Edward's spine. Child protection? Why would a psychologist specializing in child protection show up at his house unannounced? "Send her in." The woman who entered the study was in her early 40s, with blonde hair pulled back severely and a smile that seemed forced. She carried a brown folder and wore a dark suit that gave her an extremely formal appearance. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for seeing me. I'm Dr. Renee Silverman, a psychologist specializing in child protection. I'm here because we've received several anonymous complaints about the situation with your sons." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. "Complaints? What kind of complaints?" "Reports indicate there are irregularities in the children's care. Specifically, questions have been raised about the suitability of the person responsible for the baby's direct care." "Are you referring to Amelia?" "Miss Amelia Scott, correct. We have information that she lacks the proper training for specialized infant care and that she may have developed dysfunctional bonds with the children." Edward fought to remain calm. "Dr. Silverman, my sons are perfectly healthy and happy. Amelia is an exceptional caregiver. I understand your perception, Mr. Mitchell, but overly intense bonds between caregivers and children can be detrimental to the little one's emotional development. Children need to learn to handle separations and cannot depend exclusively on a single figure." "My sons don't depend exclusively on her. I am very present in their upbringing." "Yes, but according to our reports, there was a period when you were emotionally distant from the children, correct? And that Miss Scott practically assumed the role of a maternal figure." Edward felt anger begin to burn in his chest. How did this woman know such intimate details about his family? Who had provided this information? "Dr. Silverman, I don't know who gave you this information, but I can assure you that my sons are receiving all the love and care they deserve. I'm sure your intentions are the best. Mr. Mitchell, but sometimes when we're dealing with grief and trauma, our perception can be compromised. It's common for bereaved parents to have difficulty objectively assessing what is best for their children." The insinuation that he was unfit to make decisions about his own children infuriated Edward, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. "What exactly are you proposing?" "For now, a more detailed assessment of the situation. I would like to speak with Miss Scott and observe her interaction with the children. Depending on what we find, it may be necessary to consider more drastic measures. Drastic measures? Temporary removal of the children to a more suitable environment while the situation is re-evaluated. Edward had to grip the desk to keep from losing control completely. Dr. Silverman, my sons will not be leaving this house. They are safe, loved, and cared for. I understand your resistance, but I must remind you that the children's best interests are paramount. If we consider there to be risks to their well-being, we have the legal authority to intervene. The veiled threat left the air in the study tense and heavy. Edward realized he was facing something much larger and more dangerous than a simple routine evaluation. When do you intend to conduct this assessment? Tomorrow morning, if there are no objections. And if I object? You have the right to object, but that could be interpreted as a lack of cooperation with the competent authorities, which in itself could be considered an indication that there is something to hide. Edward realized he was trapped in a chess game where he didn't know the rules and where any move could be used against him. Very well, tomorrow at 9 in the morning. After the psychologist left, Edward remained alone in the study, trying to process what had just happened. How was it possible that someone could question Amelia's abilities, the very person who had saved his family from despair? He went up to the nursery, where he found Amelia playing with the twins on the colorful rug. Gabriel was trying to crawl towards a musical mobile, while Michael watched everything with his big, attentive eyes. The scene was one of normality and happiness that contrasted brutally with the accusations he had just heard. "Amelia, we need to talk." She immediately noticed the worried tone in his voice and stood up, leaving the babies under Judith's watchful eye. In the study, Edward recounted the entire conversation with the psychologist. He watched as Amelia's face gradually paled as her hands began to tremble slightly. "Someone reported us," she said in a low voice. "Someone who knows details about our routine, about how things were before and how they are now." "But who? And why?" "I don't know, but I have a bad feeling about this psychologist. Something about this whole story doesn't make sense." Edward agreed. There was something in Dr. Silverman's demeanor that bothered him deeply, something that went beyond the expected professionalism. "What do we do?" "We face it," Amelia said, and Edward saw a steely determination in her green eyes. "Gabriel and Michael are your family. They're my family now too. I won't let anyone destroy that." That night, while the babies slept peacefully in their cribs, Edward and Amelia stayed awake, planning how to protect the family they had built together. Neither of them imagined that the threat they faced was much greater and more sinister than a simple psychological evaluation. The approaching storm would test not only their ability to protect the children, but also the feelings that had begun to blossom between them, feelings they had not yet dared to name. The next morning arrived laden with a tension that seemed to electrify the air of the mansion. Edward had barely slept, and Amelia also showed signs of a sleepless night. The twins, as if sensing the adults' apprehension, woke up more restless than usual, though still far from the despair they used to show before Amelia's arrival. At 9 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Edward descended the stairs with heavy steps, preparing for a battle whose rules he still didn't fully understand. Dr. Renee Silverman was at the door, accompanied by a young woman who introduced herself as her assistant and carried a clipboard full of forms. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell. This is Paula, my assistant. She will be helping me with today's assessment." Edward led them into the living room, where Amelia was already waiting with the twins. Gabriel was playing peacefully on her lap, while Michael explored a colorful toy on the rug. The scene was one of absolute normality and family happiness. "Miss Scott, I presume," the psychologist said, addressing Amelia with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about your training and work methods." "Of course," Amelia replied, holding Gabriel securely in her arms. "Could you tell me about your academic background in childcare?" "I don't have a specific academic background. My experience comes from practical situations and an intuitive understanding of children's needs." The assistant jotted something down on the clipboard, and Edward saw a satisfied glint in the psychologist's eyes. "I see. And how exactly did you develop this intuitive understanding?" "I grew up in shelters. I learned a great deal about the emotional needs of children through my own experience." "Ah, so..." You project your own traumatic experiences onto the children under your care. Edward felt an immediate surge of anger at the malicious way the question was phrased. "It's not like that," Amelia replied, maintaining an admirable calm. "My experience helps me recognize when a child is suffering emotionally. But don't you agree that very young children shouldn't be exposed to figures with a history of abandonment? Couldn't that generate excessive separation anxiety?" "On the contrary," Edward intervened, no longer able to contain himself. "Amelia is exactly what my sons needed. Before her, they cried constantly. Now they are happy, healthy babies. Mr. Mitchell, I understand your perspective, but I would like to observe the children's interaction with other people. Could you ask Miss Scott to leave the room for a few minutes?" Edward looked at Amelia, who gave a discreet nod. She kissed Gabriel's forehead and carefully handed him to his father, then stroked Michael's hair before leaving the room. What happened in the following minutes was devastating. Gabriel, who had been perfectly calm in Amelia's lap, began to whimper as soon as she was out of his sight. Michael, realizing Amelia had disappeared, dropped his toy and began to look for her with his eyes, making sounds of distress. "Interesting," the psychologist murmured, taking notes. "Extreme dependency reaction. This confirms our suspicions." "They just miss her," Edward said, trying to soothe Gabriel, who was now crying openly. "Like any child would miss someone they love. Mr. Mitchell, children of this age should be able to be with other people without showing this level of distress. What we see here is a pathological attachment." Michael began to cry too, a cry that made Edward's heart ache. It was as if they were regressing to their previous state after just a few minutes of separation. "Can I call Amelia back?" "I'd rather you didn't. I need to see how they react without her presence." For 40 torturous minutes, the psychologist observed and took notes while the twins cried with increasing intensity. Edward tried everything, singing, making funny faces, offering toys, but nothing worked. It was as if the babies had lost the ability to calm themselves without Amelia's presence. When she finally returned to the room, the babies calmed down instantly. Gabriel reached out his little arms to her with a tear-streaked smile, and Michael stopped crying the moment he heard her voice. "Very revealing," the psychologist said, closing her folder. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to speak with you in private." In the study, away from the children and Amelia, Dr. Silverman adopted a more direct and threatening tone. "What I witnessed confirms my worst suspicions. Your sons have developed a completely inappropriate emotional dependency. They cannot function without Miss Scott's presence. They love her. It's natural for them to miss her when she's not here. This isn't healthy love, Mr. Mitchell. It's a pathological and dangerous dependency. What happens if Miss Scott decides to leave? Your sons will be permanently traumatized." Edward felt a familiar anguish tighten his chest. The same sense of inadequacy he had felt since Caroline's death returned with full force. "Furthermore," the psychologist continued, "I've noticed that you also seem emotionally dependent on her. This creates a dysfunctional family environment where an outsider has complete control over everyone's well-being." "That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you were able to calm your sons without her help? Have you developed confidence in your own abilities as a father, or have you just transferred that responsibility to someone else?" The words struck Edward like daggers. It was true that he had become dependent on Amelia's ability to handle the babies. It was true that he still felt insecure when he had to care for them alone. "Mr. Mitchell, I know this is difficult to hear, but I'm trying to protect your sons. They need to learn to trust other people, especially their own father. As long as Miss Scott is present, that will never happen." "What are you suggesting?" "That she leaves temporarily, a few weeks, maybe a month. Long enough for the children to learn to bond properly with other caregivers. They'll be devastated without her." "Initially, yes, but children are resilient. With patience and consistency, they will adapt, and you will discover that you are perfectly capable of being the father your sons need." Edward ran his hands through his hair, feeling lost and confused. He had spent months believing that Amelia was the salvation of his family, and now a specialized professional was telling him the exact opposite. "I need to think." "Of course, but don't take too long. The more time that passes, the harder it will be to break this dependency. After the psychologist left, Edward remained alone in the study, plunged into a whirlwind of doubt and guilt. What if she was right? What if he was harming his children out of fear of facing his own inadequacies as a father? He went up to the nursery, where he found Amelia softly humming as the twins slept peacefully. The scene that once brought him peace now sparked painful questions. "Amelia, can we talk?" She followed him to the study, and Edward saw in her eyes that she already knew what he was going to say. "She managed to convince you, didn't she?" "It's not that she convinced me, it's that maybe she's right about some things. Maybe I've transferred responsibilities to you that should have been mine. Edward, you're a wonderful father. I've seen how you've grown these past months, how you've gotten closer to the children. But always with you around. Alone, I still feel lost." Amelia was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was heavy with a deep sadness. "If you believe that I'm harming Gabriel and Michael, then I must leave. It's not that you're doing harm, it's just maybe they need to learn to live without depending on you so much. And you? Do you also need to learn to live without depending on me?" The question hit Edward hard. In recent months, Amelia had become much more than a nanny. She had become his confidant, his source of strength, the person who made it possible to face each new day. But maybe the psychologist was right. Maybe this dependency was harmful for everyone. Maybe so. Amelia nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting that answer. "When do you want me to go? Would today be possible?" The pain that flashed in her eyes was like a blade in Edward's heart, but he forced himself to stick to his decision. It was for the good of his sons. It was for the good of everyone. "Of course, I'll pack my things." 2 hours later, Edward watched Amelia carry her single suitcase towards the taxi that would take her away. She had said goodbye to the babies with tears in her eyes, whispering words of love that they were still too young to understand, but which they seemed to feel viscerally. Gabriel and Michael had cried throughout the farewell, as if they understood that something fundamental was being taken from their lives. "Take care," Amelia said, looking one last time at Edward. "And remember, they're stronger than you think, and so are you." The taxi departed, taking with it the person who had brought life back to that family. Edward stood at the door, holding the two inconsolably crying babies, wondering if he had made the right decision. The answer came in the hours that followed. Gabriel and Michael entered a state of despair that made Edward relive his worst nightmares. They cried non-stop, refused to eat and couldn't sleep. It was as if they had reverted exactly to the state they were in before Amelia's arrival. For 3 days, Edward tried everything. He hired a new nanny, called pediatricians, tested different methods of calming the babies. Nothing worked. The twins had fallen into a kind of infant depression that frightened everyone in the house. Judith, seeing the children's despair, confronted Edward directly. "Mr. Mitchell, with all due respect, you've made a terrible mistake. These children are suffering in a way that isn't natural." The psychologist said they would adapt. What psychologist, sir? What kind of professional separates babies from the person who loves them most in the world? It was that night, when the babies had been crying for hours on end and Edward felt he was going to lose his mind, that Judith made an unexpected suggestion. "Mr. Mitchell, why don't you look through Mrs. Caroline's things? Sometimes when we're lost, the answers are where we least expect them." Edward went up to the room that had been Caroline's, a space he had avoided since her death. Her clothes were still in the closet, her books on the shelf, her personal belongings exactly as she had left them. It was while rummaging through a dresser drawer that Edward found a wooden box he didn't remember seeing before. Inside, among photographs and small keepsakes, was an envelope with his name written in Caroline's delicate handwriting. With trembling hands, he opened the letter. "My love, Edward, if you are reading this, it's because something happened to me during childbirth. I know it might seem strange for me to write a letter like this, but in the last few days, I've been having very vivid dreams, and I'd rather be prepared. I want you to know that whatever happens, our sons will be born surrounded by love. I met someone very special during one of my hospital appointments. Amelia Scott. a nurse with a huge heart and an incredible ability to handle children. We talked a lot, and I immediately felt she was someone I could trust. Edward, if something happens to me, find Amelia. She promised she would take care of our babies if I needed her to. It's not just a professional promise, it's a commitment from the heart. She understands pain in a way that few do, and that makes her special. There's something else you need to know. During one of my trips to the hospital, a psychologist showed up asking strange questions about our family. She wanted to know about our financial situation, our plans for the children, who would care for them. Something about her attitude made me uncomfortable. When I asked the hospital about her name later, they told me there was no psychologist with the name she gave me. Be wary of this woman, Edward. Something tells me she isn't trustworthy. Take care, my love. Take care of our sons. And remember, true love appears in unexpected ways, and when it does, don't be afraid to accept it. Forever yours, Caroline. Edward reread the letter 3 times before its full meaning settled in. Amelia hadn't appeared in his life by chance. Caroline had sent her, and the psychologist who had convinced him to send her away was the very person Caroline had warned him against. He had made a terrible mistake. Not only had he sent away the person his sons loved most, but he had fallen into the trap of a woman Caroline had already been suspicious of months ago. With the letter still in his hands, Edward ran downstairs and asked Judith if she knew where Amelia had gone. "I don't." "No, sir, but I can try to find out." It was the receptionist at one of the hospitals Edward had called looking for her, who finally gave him a lead. "Oh, Amelia Scott. She was working here until a few days ago. Said she was leaving London. I think she went to Bristol to stay at an inn near the bus station." Edward didn't think twice. He left the babies with Judith and a new nanny and got in his car, driving like a desperate man along the roads leading to Bristol. He had to find Amelia. He had to bring back the person who had saved his family and whom he had sent away out of pure fear and insecurity. As he drove, he could mentally hear Gabriel and Michael's cries, and he knew that every minute away from Amelia was another minute of unnecessary suffering for his sons. Caroline's letter burned in his pocket, reminding him that true love, when it appears, should not be rejected out of fear. And Edward knew now with absolute certainty that he was in love with Amelia Scott, the woman Caroline had sent to save not only his sons but his very soul. The light rain falling over Bristol that October night made the streets slippery and visibility poor, but Edward drove with the determination of a man who had finally understood what truly mattered. With every mile covered, Caroline's letter seemed to pulse in his pocket, reminding him that he had ignored the most obvious signs and nearly destroyed the family he loved so much. The peaceful Nook Inn was on a quiet street near the centre of Bristol. A simple 2-story building with a faded yellow facade and a poorly kept garden. Edward parked the car and ran to the reception, where a middle-aged woman was watching television behind the counter. "Good evening, I'm looking for a guest named Amelia Scott." The receptionist examined him with some suspicion before replying. "Room 16, 2nd floor, but it's almost 11 o'clock at night, mister. It's urgent, a family emergency." Edward took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding as if it would explode. He stopped in front of room 16 and took a deep breath before knocking. "Amelia, it's me, Edward." He heard slow footsteps, a long pause, and finally the door opened. Amelia was in a bathrobe, her hair down, her eyes red from crying. Upon seeing him, her expression went through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, hope, and finally, a painful caution. "Edward, what are you doing here? Did something happen to the boys?" "Yes, something happened. They're devastated without you. They won't stop crying, they won't eat, they can't sleep. Amelia, I've made a terrible mistake." She stared at him for a long moment, fighting back tears that threatened to overflow. "Come in," she finally said, making space for him to pass. The room was small and sparse, with a single bed, a worn-out armchair, and a window overlooking the inn's inner courtyard. Amelia's suitcase was open on the bed, clothes folded as if she were preparing to leave again. "Amelia, I found a letter from Caroline." He took the envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. He watched as her eyes widened in recognition of his wife's handwriting. Where did you find this? Among her things. A letter she wrote before giving birth in case something happened. Amelia read the letter in silence, and Edward saw tears streaming down her face. Caroline asked me to take care of you, she whispered. But you didn't know that. When I arrived at your house, I didn't mention it because I thought it would sound too strange. That's why you showed up before I had posted a new ad. Caroline had told you about our situation. She was worried. She said she felt something might happen during the birth and wanted to be sure the babies would be well cared for. Edward sat on the edge of the bed, the guilt weighing on his shoulders like a boulder. Amelia, the psychologist who convinced me to send you away. Caroline warned me about that woman. In the letter, she said she showed up at the hospital asking strange questions, and that when she investigated, she found out she wasn't who she claimed to be. Amelia stopped reading and stared at him with an alarmed expression. Edward, you don't understand. This woman could be involved in something very dangerous. What do you mean? I've heard stories about people who pose as professionals to infiltrate vulnerable families, especially families with babies. There's a market, a terrible market for young children. Edward's blood ran cold. The possibility Amelia was suggesting was too terrifying to contemplate. You think I don't know, but we need to go back. Now. They made the journey back to London in tense silence, each lost in dark thoughts about the possible implications of the situation. Amelia held Caroline's letter against her chest like a protective amulet. They arrived at the Kensington mansion at 3 in the morning. Before they even opened the door, they could hear the desperate cries of the twins echoing through the house. Judith appeared in the hallway, exhausted and worried. Thank God you're back, Mr. Mitchell. The boys are doing very badly. They can't be calmed down at all. Amelia ran up to the nursery, and what happened next was like witnessing a miracle. The moment Gabriel and Michael heard her voice, their crying ceased abruptly. When she entered the room and they saw her, the transformation was instantaneous and dramatic. Gabriel reached out his little arms to her with a tear-streaked smile, while Michael began to babble sounds of joy. It was as if two small, lost souls had found their way home. "My loves," Amelia whispered, picking up both babies and holding them against her chest. "Mama's back, I'll never leave you again." Edward watched the scene, with tears in his eyes, finally understanding the depth of the bond that existed between Amelia and his sons. It wasn't pathological dependency. It was pure, true love. But the joy of their reunion was interrupted by the doorbell ringing insistently. Edward went down to answer, wondering who could be at his door in the middle of the night. To his surprise and horror, it was Dr. Renee Silverman, accompanied by 2 women who introduced themselves as social workers. "Mr. Mitchell, we received information that Miss Scott has returned. This is a direct violation of our instructions." Dr. Silverman, "My sons were in extreme distress without her." "Exactly as we expected. Mr. Mitchell, I have a warrant for the temporary removal of the children. They will be taken to a temporary foster home until the situation is properly resolved." Edward felt the world collapse around him. "This is impossible. You can't take my sons." "We can and we will. The situation has gotten out of control, and now we must take drastic measures." It was at that moment that Edward made a desperate decision. With Caroline's letter still in his pocket, he pulled out his phone and called Detective Marcus Fisher, a long-time friend. "Marcus, I know it's 3 in the morning, but I need urgent help. Someone is trying to take my sons based on false accusations." As he spoke on the phone, Edward watched the psychologist and her companions with growing suspicion. Something in their behavior was inconsistent with professionals genuinely concerned about the children's well-being. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, accompanied by 2 police officers. Edward had quickly explained the situation over the phone, including the suspicions raised by Caroline's letter. "Dr. Renee Silverman," Marcus said, approaching the psychologist, "could you show us your official identification?" "Of course," she replied, but Edward noticed a hesitation in her voice he hadn't perceived before. While she fumbled in her bag for her documents, Marcus whispered to Edward, "We did a quick check. There is no Dr. Renee Silverman registered with the London Regional Psychology Board. Edward's blood ran cold. His worst suspicions were being confirmed. "Here they are," the woman said, handing a professional ID card to Marcus. The detective examined the document for a few seconds before handing it back with a grave expression. "This identification is a forgery. Ma'am, I need you to come with us for questioning." What happened next was a rapid and shocking sequence of events. The fake psychologist tried to run but was apprehended by the officers. One of the social workers tried to argue, but Marcus had already requested a check on their identities as well. Under interrogation at the police station, the terrifying truth came to light. The woman posing as Dr. Renee Silverman was actually Sandra Morgan, involved in an international illegal adoption ring. Her method was to identify vulnerable families, especially widowers or single mothers with babies, and create situations of forced separation between parents and children. She confessed everything, Marcus reported to Edward the next day. "The plan was to convince you that you were harming the children, separate you from Amelia, and then show up with the fake warrant to take the babies. They already had buyers in the United States willing to pay a huge sum for healthy twins." Edward felt nauseous imagining the fate his sons would have had if he hadn't found Caroline's letter in time. "How did she know about our family?" "Apparently, she had contacts at the hospital where your wife had her prenatal care. Someone passed on information about your situation. Recent widower, 2 babies, wealthy family. The perfect profile for her scam." The investigation revealed that Sandra and her network had stolen dozens of children over the years, always using the same strategy: infiltrate as a healthcare professional, create distrust and separation, and then appear with false documentation to protect the children. 2 weeks later, when the entire legal situation was resolved and Sandra was in prison awaiting trial, Edward finally found the courage to talk about the feelings he had discovered during those terrifying days. It was a sunny Sunday afternoon. Amelia was playing with Gabriel and Michael in the mansion's garden, the 3 of them laughing at something only they understood. Watching that scene, Edward felt an absolute certainty about what he wanted for the rest of his life. "Amelia," he called, approaching the group, "can I talk to you?" She left the babies playing on the lawn under Judith's watchful eye and followed him to the jasmine-covered pergola where Edward had spent so many happy afternoons with Caroline. "Amelia, I need to tell you something I've been feeling for a long time, but only had the courage to admit when I almost lost you." She looked at him with those green eyes that had become the safe harbor for the entire family. "Caroline sent you to us. I have no doubt about that. But what started as fulfilling a promise has turned into something much bigger." Edward knelt before her, taking a small blue velvet box from his pocket. "Amelia Scott, you brought my sons back to life. You brought me back to life. You taught us that it's possible to love again after loss, that it's possible to build a family where there was once only pain." Tears began to stream down Amelia's face. "I love you," Edward continued, opening the box to reveal a simple and elegant diamond ring. "I love you like I never thought it would be possible to love again. Will you marry me? Will you make official what we already are? A family?" Amelia looked at Gabriel and Michael, who were playing happily on the lawn, then looked at Edward kneeling before her, and felt her heart overflow with a happiness she had never imagined possible. "Edward, I love you too. I love the 3 of you more than my own life. Yes, I want to marry you. I want to be a mother to Gabriel and Michael. I want us to be a real family." Edward slid the ring onto her finger and kissed her softly, sealing a promise of love that had been born from pain but would transform into infinite joy. Gabriel and Michael, as if understanding the importance of the moment, began to babble and clap their hands, drawing emotional laughter from the adults. 3 months later, on a sunny Saturday in January, Edward and Amelia were married in an intimate ceremony in the mansion's garden. Gabriel and Michael, now almost a year old, served as little page boys carried in Judith's arms to the makeshift altar under the trees. During the ceremony, Edward felt Caroline's presence like a gentle breeze touching his face, and he was certain she was there, smiling as she watched the family she had helped create through her prophetic letter. "I, Edward, take you, Amelia, to be my wife," he said, looking into the eyes of the woman who had saved his family. "I promise to love, respect, and care for you, not only as my wife, but as the mother of our sons. I, Amelia, take you, Edward, to be my husband, she replied, her voice choked with emotion, and I promise to love Gabriel and Michael as the children of my heart, always honoring the memory of Caroline, who sent me to care for what she loved most in the world. When they kissed, sealing their union, Gabriel shouted "Mama" for the first time, causing the small gathering to erupt in emotional tears. That night, when the babies finally fell asleep in their cribs, Edward and Amelia sat on the veranda, watching the stars and talking about their plans for the future. "Do you believe Caroline really planned all of this?" Amelia asked, nestled against her husband's chest. "I believe that true love finds ways to perpetuate itself," Edward replied. "Caroline knew we would need you, and she knew you would need us too." "Sometimes I think I can still feel her presence," Amelia confessed, "as if she's still watching over all of us." "She is, and she always will be." The Kensington mansion, once a silent mausoleum, now vibrated again with life, laughter, and love. Gabriel and Michael grew up surrounded by affection, secure in the love of their parents. Edward had rediscovered his capacity for happiness. Amelia had finally found the family she had been searching for her entire life. And somewhere, in the memories held within those walls, Caroline smiled, knowing that her last act of love had worked out exactly as she had dreamed. Life had proven, once again, that true love is indestructible, and that even in the most painful circumstances, there is always room for new beginnings and new happiness. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Edward, Amelia, Gabriel, and Michael has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of love, loss, and rebirth, leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments which moment stood out to you the most. Every day we bring intense stories like this one, revealing the most beautiful and transformative side of the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the next episode with another narrative that will make you believe in the power of true love.